everyone to the Migration Summit 2023 and this session on cultivating compassionate systems change to advance refugee education and livelihood. My name is Lana Cook. I am of the MIT Refugee Action Hub here at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the MIT Systems Awareness Lab, and I'm wearing both of those hats today. I'm really weaving together my work over the last few years within refugee and migration, particularly in advancing education and workforce development for refugee and displaced communities, as well as my work as a systems thinker and how do we cultivate compassionate systems change within education systems. So this interactive session is kind of bringing together those two areas to think about how do we create the conditions for us as a community, for us as practitioners, as educators, as advocates and activists, to work together to create systems change. And we'll talk about a bit what that means. What does systems change mean? What does compassion have to do with all of that? And really, we'll have some opportunities to practice together. Because this work is not one we can just kind of passively listen to, but really more around how do we work with one another to understand these ideas and really think about how these ideas apply to each in our individual context. So thank you for joining us. So, when I came to thinking about this session, and for this session to kick off the Migration Summit, coming after our fantastic opening session today. If you didn't have a chance to join us, the recording will be up on our YouTube in the coming days, where we heard the incredibly moving and powerful story of Omar from Syria and his resiliency, the trauma he faced in his experience of political persecution. And there's a weight to hearing stories like those. There's a weight to facing the complexities that impact refugees and migrants and our global communities. And when we sit with the pain or the suffering of others, how do we attend to our own well-being? How do we take care of ourselves and take care of others? How do we sit with that suffering of another, but act towards the desire to help? And that's compassion, right? It's our ability to hold space for one another and to use that to motivate us, to activate us so that we can really be working together to alleviate that suffering. And so this session is looking at some of the tools that help us kind of cultivate those capacities. I came to thinking about systems and compassionate systems through the really pioneering work of a community that's led by Peter Senge and Meta Bowl of the Center for Systems Awareness. And they're both here at MIT with this new lab, the MIT Systems Awareness Lab. And through their work with the Center for Systems Awareness, they work with an incredible group of educators in the US and around the world who are really interested in how do we, create sustainable change that leads to the thriving of not only students, but educators, families, and communities within education. And so much of that is working at not only the kind of collective system, how schools, how universities are designed and operated, but to the relational space. How do students and educators show up with one another? How do we show up as educators? And that really kind of inspires and drives me and my work here within the Refugee Action Hub and React. And how do we show up within this community, within dealing with the complexities of that refugees and migrants face, and how do we be a best of service? And so a lot of that really means attending to not only that personal space, that relationship space, that institutional space, and really learning how do I navigate amidst this kinds of complexity. As I talked about earlier in the opening session, here within React, we really think about our work as systems work. It's so necessary to do so. as we are designing and running our programs and our certificates in computer and data science, which really build these bridges from education to employment. And I talked about this as opening session, so it might be a repeat for some, but that if at one end, foundationally, there's not access to online learning programs like we have here at MIT. There's not access to the internet, to electricity, to basic literacies, to the safety and well-being of learners. Well, how is our program going to reach anyone? So we have to attend to that space, that foundational space that enables people to have the readiness and opportunity to learn, right? And if then our program, which is seeking to bridge those gaps from education to employment, if on the other end of that sector, we have global, our country restrictions on right to work for refugees, as we see in some countries, that if we have discriminatory hiring practices by companies, if we have hostile work environments to refugees and migrants, if we have, government restrictions to, legal pathways to reside, to then access to healthcare, access to childcare, access to mental health services. I mean, all of these kinds of systems are always already interacting with one another. And so we have to, as we're doing even one piece of our work, and there's a necessary, necessity to focus, on, okay, this is my intervention, but how am I attending to the greater systems that are impacting my particular intervention or my particular work or organization? How do I work with others who are doing work within those spaces? And how do we partner together so that we, as much as we can, really begin to sense into the different systems and how they're working with one another? So today we'll just look at some of the tools advanced by practitioners and leaders like Peter Senge and Meadow Bull around how do we understand the different complexities, the different intersecting systems that impact the space of refugee and migrant education and livelihood. So when some of the things that we're going to cover today is, not only looking at kind of the individual spaces that you work within. So, what you might do as an educator, as a practitioner, as a researcher, but also the systems you might live within individually. And so I ask you to kind of hold both of those dimensions. So your kind of own personal experience and story, as well as any kind of institutional space that you might be sort of carrying. And one of the things that I find in Lorraine Charles, my co-chair here of the Migration Summit, in our opening session, we talked about ways of showing up, what are the kind of values we carry here within the Migration Summit. And I want you to hold those today around, how do we really hold space for one another? How do we create spaces for kind of safe risk-taking, inquiry, exploration? How do we really attend to how we are listening and holding space for one another? And I'll share something that my teachers will use around ways of sort of showing up, and that there's a kind of maybe 4 classical ways we could talk about somebody sort of showing up to a session like this, a professional development session or a workshop. And so, and I'll, invite me to have a little caricature here. So we could show up as a vacationer. So I'm just gonna relax, I'm gonna sit back, maybe I'll sip my coffee, and I'm just gonna, tune in. Maybe I have my sunglasses on. Maybe I'll pretend I'm at a beach, right? So I could, we could show up as the vacationer. We could show up, and I hope no one's here showing up in this way, as being told to show up. So we're captive or prisoner. We're here, but we're like this, right? And you might have gone to some professional development or class or a meeting like that, and you're like, is this over yet? And if you're here in that way, you can go. We're not holding anyone captive here. So if you're finding yourself in that mode, give yourself some gentleness and some space, and tune into the recording perhaps. But do invite you to stay. We could show up as the sophisticate. I've heard this all before. I know what she's going to say. I've got a theory about this. And, as much as we in this session are going to invite in different people's expertise, and I actually have some colleagues who have joined me in the Master Practitioner program for the Center for Systems Awareness. So I have some people with even more expertise than me. But to show up as the sophisticate is in a mode where we're actually not really open to learning. We're just there to kind of prove our own knowledge. And what does that sort of shut down from our ability to really to learn and to listen? And then a kind of final way that we could show up today is as the explorer, right? Right? Like what's ahead on that horizon with a kind of curiosity, a sense of inquiry, a sense of adventure. So I invite you to come and join us as explorers today. We're going to do a couple, different kinds of things. So I just, invite you to come in with kind of that open heart and that open mind. So I'm going to share my screen because we're going to go into some tools and practices, like I said, that have been developed by my colleagues, Peter Senge and Meta Bull, and other practitioners within this compassionate system space, which I think is just an exciting kind of field that's really doing some impactful work within education, and I think has so much to bring within this space of refugee and migrant education. Love for us to be practicing with us today. So I first want to talk about leadership. I'd like you to just share in the chat, what's your kind of ideas of leadership? Who's a leader? What do leaders bring to the table? Who can be a leader? How do we understand leadership kind of traditionally? And maybe I should have done this before I share my slide. So I'll stop share for a second. You might have got a sneak preview, but just inviting you to just share. What does a leader mean to you? They understand service, ability to inspire, to bring motivation for the team. Goal setters, they steer the course for others. I'm loving these caring connections. I'm loving these definitions because what you all are sharing is the kinds of qualities or spirits that we see in leaders. But sometimes we can get kind of stuck on that word leader or leadership, right? We think it's just somebody with a kind of structural position of power, right? That they've made it to a particular title within an organization, and that's, what leadership it is. But I love what Julie Caspar just shared. It can be anyone, and it is everyone. And this session today is about how do you cultivate that kind of leadership in yourself, because everyone here is demonstrating that leadership. I think even by being part of the summit here today is that you're seeing some vision in your community that you want to kind of advance. And work today is about, in part, cultivating some of that vision. So I'll go back to sharing my screen here and share this diagram that Peter Senge developed within his kind of classic organizational learning text, The Fifth Discipline, around the three-legged stool of leadership. And these are kind of the core capacities or capabilities for a team, for an individual leader, recognizing leadership is for everyone, right? And one is what people have shared in this chat, that vision, that aspiration, some sense of, not only an individual, but shared vision among a community. Here we also have kind of a sense of personal mastery. And that's that ability to kind of really hold an awareness of ourselves and hold ourselves in a kind of accountability of how am I showing up as a leader? How am I showing up within spaces like these, right? What is my ability to really kind of hold and listen? Which brings us to this next kind of pillar in that stool, is around reflective conversations. So how do we be in that listening quality, understanding, responding, and acting with others, as we see here in the chat, creating and sustaining that community, is that ability to have mirrors to ourselves, right? To be able to see the world in different kinds of ways, to invite in different kinds of perspectives, and to be able to kind of really work with our different mental models, our biases, so that we make sure we really are representing the whole that we're trying to be in service of. Right? And then the last pillar here is around understanding complexity. And as I started with, how do we kind of sit with and hold the kinds of complexities that we face within this domain of refugee and migrant experiences? And so how do we understand systems? How do we cultivate ourselves as systems thinkers to really understand those profound interconnections between ourselves, our organizations, to our planet, right? I mean, as we're seeing in this moment of really alarming and climate change, and a real need for us to understand those profound interconnections that we all have with our natural world, and the ways that we can show up differently towards the healing and restoration of that one. And so today we're going to actually cover on each of these different dimensions in a small way. So we're going to practice within that space of understanding systems. We'll start there, looking at this tool called the Systems Thinking Iceberg. And so how do we understand the complex systems that impact refugee and migrant education? We'll, in some small breakouts, practice that space of reflective conversation. How do we be in dialogue as a community? How do we hold space for each other? How do we begin to, in that explorer mode, question and have some inquiry around our mental models and how we come to different perspectives about these issues? And then how do we kind of begin to create not only those individual, but those shared visions, those aspirations for the work that you do and for this Migration Summit community? So it's a preview of what's ahead for us today. So I'd like us now to go into the systems thinking iceberg. And if you haven't already, it can be helpful to have a journal, a piece of paper, because I'm going to have you do a little bit of drawing today. It's like a really interactive session, as I promised. If you only have a computer screen in front of you, you can just kind of take some notes. But as you'll see in a moment, drawing is really good. So if you need a moment to go run and get a piece of paper, a pencil or a paper, crayon, anything, please go ahead and do so. So I'll give you just a moment. So I'm hoping we're all returning here back. So we'll start with the systems thinking iceberg. And some of you may have seen this in other spaces. The tools and practices that I share are really part of a community with a kind of open source mindset. So these are under the Creative Commons, free for people to reuse and remix and adapt to make your own. And so you might see even different versions if you Google, systems thinking iceberg, different models of these tools. And here we want to be thinking about, what is happening when we think about complexity, when we think about complex systems. What is influencing particular kinds of events or experiences to happen? So what is shaping it? How do we understand those kind of complex systems? Because sometimes it can just sort of feel like this sort of blur of like, okay, sort of everything's kind of coming at me. I'm hearing this information from this side and that side. How do I sort of make sense of what's happening within a particular situation? And tools like this help us sort of diagram out and make sense and sort of sort out. And like any kind of model in the world, and there's a great quote. Now his name's gonna escape me, but we'll find. Oh, the statistician George Box. There we go. It comes back to me. A quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this is a useful model, right? It helps us kind of understand and explain the world in a particular kind of way. So here we have the model of an iceberg. And as we know about icebergs, about 10% is above the surface of the water. And everything else is underneath that water. Opaque to us, if we were in a ship, we'd only see that tip of the iceberg, but we wouldn't see this large mass underneath. And often when we're facing kind of complex events or emergencies, situations, we'll see what's kind of up ahead, but we know there's a much more under the water, right? And sometimes we can really sense into that. Sometimes we're the ones who are feeling kind of under the water, unseen by those who are in the ship looking ahead. And so how do we make visible, kind of what's there and what's happening? And so underneath that kind of particular event, and here I'll begin to ground it in this space of refugee and migrant issues. So for example, we have a humanitarian emergency. And here I'm, in my heart, holding those in Syria and Turkey who are profoundly affected by such a humanitarian emergency after the earthquake. In that event, we look, what's under the surface there? Different kinds of patterns of behavior, right? What happens after that event, for example? So typically we'll see these kind of habitual responses. We'll see donations flood in. volunteers coming to aid, humanitarian or aid organizations distributing goods, materials, healthcare, emergency response. But that over time, that response begins to lessen and go away, yet there's still need within those communities, right? And we find, this kind of frustration of, why is this support still needed, but it's not sustained? Or, where are the local agencies or actors and how are they empowered within this space? So we have those kind of habitual responses to then maybe there's the next emergency somewhere else. And the aid and the donations, the news, attention, they go there. And that community is left. And what happened? How do we rebuild? How do we restore? And so as we're thinking about that, it'd be easy or tempting to be almost to cast blame on, well, everybody moved on to the next event, right? What about us? Why isn't anybody paying attention to us? And so many of you who have had these lived experiences, maybe you're coming from Haiti or Somalia, South Africa, Ethiopia, might have had these times where the world, Ukraine, the world was behind, and then it seems that aid goes away, it disappeared. So how do we understand what are these different systems that are in place that are shaping that? So there we want to be looking at kind of underneath those sort of patterns of behavior, what are those kind of underlying dynamics? And so one way we might look at this is through the artifacts within the system, the kind of infrastructure of how humanitarian aid is deployed, the organizations of large kind of different non-government associations, organizations, or nonprofits, government agencies, and how do they work with local community actors, whether that works or doesn't work, or if that's broken or thriving. We want to look at the metrics. What is valued within the system? Is it the aid that was dispersed within a quick amount of time, how donations were used within a quick amount of time? The kind of emergency response, or the long-term sustainability and reconstruction of a community. And so the different kinds of metrics, and here we're suspending some judgment, or just sorry, what is there? How do we sort of see truthfully or clearly, and just kind of mark out, what kinds of organizations, infrastructure, metrics, who has authority to make decisions, who's in the room when decisions are made, all of that shape those patterns of behavior, how people respond to a particular event. In addition to those kind of structural artifacts, which are sometimes the kind of things that feel really tangible and can sometimes be the things we might point most quickly to. I think about within organizational dynamics, there's often a call, we just need a new spreadsheet or we need a new software and then all of our problems will be fixed. Because we think, technology will just be this nice, helpful aid, right? And it's sort of leaning on that artifact of technology that it's going to change all the behaviors in the system and change the events, with not really attending to all those humans who are using those pesky technologies and spreadsheets and may or may not activate them in particular ways. And so we equally need to attend to our mental models, how we are thinking, acting, and feeling within the space. And that these are sort of habitual responses, right? So our kind of first response before we pause and think or reflect, do I get agitated? Or am I in pain or sorrow when I hear a particular event that might lead me to donate, for example, to that cause? But that once that immediate kind of headline or news event is gone, then maybe my attention moves elsewhere, right? And so how are people what are those both sort of conscious or unconscious biases, perspectives, values that people might shape their behavior and shape their response to particular kinds of events? And so tools like these help us kind of look deeper into, okay, what is contributing in the case that I've shared, humanitarian response to a climate disaster or natural disaster, right? And that pattern of behavior, flood of donations, flood of aid, but short-term, quick fix, not a sustainable kind of support or reconstruction, often led by larger agencies, not by local communities. So if we look at those underlying dynamics, we see infrastructure of, and again, suspending judgment, just looking at what is. large non-governmental organizations that are very expert in delivering these types of aid, yet lack of coordination often with local offices. Metrics around immediate response, number of funds, people served without necessarily always attending to the longer term and how to support that reconstruction and empowerment of refugees and migrants who are in local communities who are affected by these disasters. Mental models around what people need, right? So the different kinds of assumptions about what local communities need, sometimes without necessarily consulting local communities. Habits of thought or feeling around, support or donations coming or volunteerism coming from an emotional place, and yet then a sort of a burnout or fatigue among volunteers or people in the headlines, seeing things in the headlines, and then attaching, right? Like, oh, it's too much for me to sort of take, and so now I'm going to kind of walk away, and then that community is still so greatly in need and still holding that suffering, right? So how do we, really sustain with communities in that suffering? And so all of those kind of dynamics, and many more than, and some might be coming to your mind as we're walking through these examples, all of these different kind of mental models, all of these artifacts are shaping the ways people habitually behave and the events that occur. And so we might, when we're doing systems change work or changing, and to just kind of talk for a moment what we mean by systems change, is how do we change or transform, change shape of how people behave within systems, how then different events kind of occur. And sometimes we can just sort of focus on that patterns of behavior. Okay, we need a different way of deploying aid, or here we'll add a month extra of support after the emergency response, and that will kind of solve the kind of quick fix nature. We sustained for an extra month or an extra 2 months or an extra year, so that we have a protracted emergency humanitarian response without necessarily actually focusing on empowerment, but just again on a sort of dependency sort of model. Versus how do we begin to address at that level of the mental models, at the level of the artifacts? We really kind of more profoundly shape how people behave and then what we see coming out of that. So, speaking for a long time, now I'd like us to begin practicing and making this more complex or more concrete to you and your own experiences. So I'd like you to take out those journals, take out those pieces of paper, maybe you have a drawing tool on your computer, and I want you to draw out an iceberg. So we won't be judged on our artistry, so just make a simple sketch. And you might label it as we have here, just to kind of help you begin thinking through these sort of categories. As you begin to sketch it out, I'd like you to think of an event, and it could be a singular, like a specific event that happened, or kind of a recurring issue, challenge that you see within your community. It should be something specific, something that is meaningful to you, that you feel is complex and you want to explore. So it may be something that you've been kind of wrestling with. And so that's where, it's meaningful, it's specific. So take a moment and think of that event, and then begin to diagram out. And these are just notes for yourself, but sketch out each of these layers of the iceberg. What is shaping, contributing to that event happening within your space? So just to take 5 minutes here, just to journal and to draw. We'll just take a few more moments, and I'd like you to really push yourself, what are those habits of thought, feeling, the mental models, ideas, values that contribute to this event occurring? What structures, organizations, policies, metrics are shaping this event? So continue to just dive into those deeper waters. What's like happening in those spaces? It's contributing to these events happening over time. So have you just kind of finish up any kind of notes, and you'll keep these notebooks, these, drawings out to kind of continue to build to. As we enter into some breakout groups, and so we'll be in for breakout groups of around 4. I'm mindful that some will be joining from low bandwidth environments, and so it's okay. I mean, certainly we would love to have cameras on and see people's faces, but in some settings that people are unable to. And similarly, if people have trouble being able to kind of unmute and speak, we can also respect that as well. We can invite you to even use the chat, for example, if that's the best modality for you while you're in that breakout space, or you can be just kind of in listening mode if you're unable to join. But that this interactive breakout is really a space for you to share your iceberg in your experiences, and it's up to you and your comfort in terms of what you want to share, in terms of, especially if it's something maybe very personal to you, and that you want to kind of share it in a more abstract way or generalized way. That's perfectly good as well. And so we'll have a chance for everybody just to kind of give an overview of what they learned or explored in doing this iceberg tool. So you might kind of give a summary of the events, the patterns of the behavior, and those underlying dynamics that you might have discovered. And as we share, we're going to do kind of what we, within the Center for Systems Awareness community, call this check-in protocol, which is really around, back to that earlier slide about kind of personal mastery and how we show up, how do we really kind of attend to kind of how we come onto a space, and particularly to our quality of listening. How do we listen and hold space for one another? And so as we do this breakout group check-in, sharing about our icebergs, I ask for each of you to, when someone speaks, they have the floor, right? It's their turn to share. And certainly we want to be mindful of time, that we leave enough time. We'll have 15 minutes for these groups of 4. So you'll each have, about 3 to 4 minutes each. Letting someone really kind of share, not necessarily engaging in the kind of cross-talk. Oftentimes when we're listening, we're often just listening so we can say something smart or funny or, to what someone has said. Here we're just listening. We're just holding space for their experience. And so the first person will talk and everyone will listen. Then the next person will share and everyone will listen. And then the next and the next. And only after everyone has shared who would like to share, then you can engage in that kind of crosstalk, which is vibrant and is a great exchange. But we really want to be attending to how are we listening and really approaching with that explorer mindset, right? So that we can really be learning from each other within this space. Okay? So Camilla's going to send us out into those breakouts. So we'll have those opportunities to each share your iceberg experience, and then we'll come back for some group reflection. So we'll see you in 15 minutes.
Okay, guys, off you go. Please let us know if you have any issues when joining the breakouts, okay? We'll be letting you know how much time you have left in a few minutes. Have fun.
All right, welcoming everyone back. I'd love just to hear any reflections on what was that experience like to practice with that tool. What kinds of insights did you have? So feel free to unmute yourself, or you can also share in the chat.
Maybe I'll begin. It's interesting. I didn't get a chance to speak, but that's okay. One thing I found was a lot of the mental models behind a lot of the events were similar, despite the events being different. So in my group, we spoke about 2 places in the US where they're incoming asylum seekers and refugees, and the mental models were similar to what I thought for my situation. Different context, different location, but the mental models behind these events and patterns were very similar. So I thought that was interesting.
Right. right? That, profound realization so many of us will have, that we're more alike than we are different. And sometimes in shaping sometimes these events that we don't want to be seeing. How do we work at maybe at that level? Because there is something shared in terms of that mental model. And we work at that level, what would that mean in terms of events happening in different contexts, in different spaces around the world, right? Other reflections?
I'll jump in. I found it very efficient as a way to just sort of organize thoughts quickly and clearly. That's what I think models are meant to do. And it worked really well for me this morning. I've already been in multiple meetings and was a bit all over the place. And I was able to put some thoughts down quite quickly. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's what I find as well. It's just they're tools to think with, right? And they help us kind of reflect and process, especially things that I think of as like, the knotted, where it's like, how do I even begin to unknot this complexity, especially when it carries an emotional weight? And yet this helps us just kind of diagram it out in a particular way. Other thoughts, insights, or questions, about this tool? All right, well, I'll move us on to another tool that we'll practice with.
Wait.
Yeah, please,
I was
Evan.
a little
Yeah,
late
no.
on muting by accident. I had some difficulty figuring out the difference between events and patterns of behaviors when I was doing my notes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to put back up the iceberg so we can kind of look and kind of see it together again. And so, and maybe, Evan, you could kind of share a little bit more about either your example or even in parts of the conversation that you just had, where you're thinking about that difference between the events and the patterns of behavior, where you're feeling a little caught.
Okay, we didn't use too much of the words events and patterns of behaviors, but so more about in my own notes when I was trying to plan. Events are things that people do. And so often I ended up writing the things that were happening as things someone did or an organization would do, which then isn't that a pattern of behavior and not just an event. So it was hard for me to know when was I writing about an event or multiple events and when was that now actually a pattern of behavior.
Yeah. And I think the line between those is a bit porous. I mean, like, in terms of where, for me, when it becomes sort of an event, is that something has kind of disrupted the kind of everyday in a way that people go, stop and said, what happened here? Right? There's something that happened that creates whether it's a kind of an emotional or kind of cognitive urgency, so that it makes us want to go, what led to this, right? And then often when we're, whether it's a situation at work or within a school or within a community, and we're saying, okay, why did this emergency happen, or this bad outcome, or even this positive outcome? And I'll say you can use this tool in a really beautiful aspirational way. Right? What kinds of positive outcomes do I want to see? And what kinds of behaviors, mental models, artifact structures need to be there present within the system to create us being able to look at an event and go, look at that success, look at that accomplishment. So it's often when it rises to the surface of our awareness that we noticed sort of something happened, versus the kind of patterns of behavior we might notice, they're visible to us. But we might not always be looking at the ways that they're interacting with one another to cause those events until something happens that makes us go, ooh, let's look. And often we can kind of stay at this patterns of behavior of, for example, scapegoating an individual. Oh, if she just did this differently, or he showed up to his work in this particular way, everything would be different, right? Or if this organization didn't make that request of us, without actually looking at, okay, what's sort of happening under the surface on these mental models and artifacts that are shaping those people to behave in those particular kinds of ways, right? But I'll agree with you, sometimes the delineations of them are a little tricky in terms of kind of where kind of one tips over to the event. But for me, it's often something that has sparked our notice in a particular kind of way that makes us want to really go and look and investigate.
Thank you. That helps a lot.
So I'll have us move now to another kind of concept. And part of this is really having us think about where and how we show up within these icebergs. And I hope as you're working on this tool with one another, we're kind of adding, and if you hadn't had a chance to now, add in what others' reflections helped you kind of think about. And one layer of that might be thinking, where do your own mental models show up? How are you shaping or contributing to the different artifacts within the systems, the different behavioral patterns, right? Because sometimes when we talk about systems change, we can talk about, I need to go change the systems out there, right? It's as if there's all these forces that are sort of impacting us and we're sort of the victim of them rather than in the systems ourselves. And very much we could be victimized by such systems or impacted by such systems. That's in part why we're all here, right? In this migration summit, is to really work with the systems that are, contributing or not contributing to refugee and migrant thriving. But what I invite you to really think about is where you show up within that system, that we are all part of the system, right? And so when we think about systems change, we really want to be thinking about our place within that and how we contribute or shape those mental models, those artifacts, those behavioral patterns, those events that occur. And within this space, we really want to be thinking about how do we show up? So I share another concept, and this is advanced by Dr. Meta Bowl of the Center for Systems Awareness around generative social fields. And this is a fancy label or word for really around what does it mean to be in relation, right? And so I'll kind of narrow us for a moment on this little stick figures, but it's sometimes an effective way to sort of diagram ideas. This person with those little red squiggles, right? Every day, right now, you are all showing up as complex systems, right? You have your emotional system, you have your, you have your limbic system, your digestive system, you have your respiratory system, right? Your immune system. And so you are always already, a complex system. How you woke up, how you slept this last night, what you've had for food today, the environment that's around you are all shaping how you show up in this moment. So some of you might be tired. One participant said, I've already been in many meetings today, so my mind was a little full, right? We're always showing up with all of these things impacting us. And part of it is how do we cultivate awareness of how we are showing up within our own system, right? And that goes back to that three-legged stool and that personal mastery piece. How do we cultivate that awareness? How am I showing up, right? Am I showing up in a reactive space, those habitual patterns of behavior that are quick responses, perhaps not taking moments of reflection or pause, right? How am I as a listener? And so my invitation with that check-in protocol to attend to our quality of listening to one another. So how do we reflect on the systems that we inhabit very personally? And then, so we have the gift of being human beings, we're in relationship with other people. So we've got this other little system here, right? And so as we encounter people even on Zoom screens like these, we're interacting with someone else's system, right? And so we're influenced on all of those factors that I just spoke of. And so then we became a relational system. And then this grows and grows in terms of complexity, right? We've got our family systems and how we show up in our family systems. We might be parts of teams, classrooms, out of schools, different institutions or workplaces, community organizations, to even the wider society. And a very much important factor here too, and then our natural ecosystems and how we're in relationship with all the flora and fauna of the world, right? And so we're all in these relationships. And part of this work in cultivating compassionate systems change is really attending to how am I showing up within the system? How am I in relationship to others? And how do I show up in a way that's generative versus degenerative? And so by generative, I mean one that promotes trust and creativity and support, deep listening, so that we can do the difficult work that we seek to do together, so that we can achieve those aspirations and visions that we want to see in the world. Versus degenerative, toxic, guarded, siloed, not trusting, really fraught with power and hierarchy, to bias, discriminatory, in some cases, right? And how do we each show up maybe to those types of systems or those types of dynamics in the system? And so what we're seeking to cultivate with this work is that kind of generative space, a space where there's mutual respect, trust, listening, but that we are each responsible for that, right? We can't say, and you might experience this, especially now where there's, I think one of the sort of silver linings, if you will, of the COVID-19 pandemic is a real renewed attention to mental health and culture within workplaces. But sometimes people can say, oh, our culture needs to fix. We need a healthier culture. But I'm not going to take any responsibility for shaping that culture. So it's almost like management over there needs to do it. No, we are all responsible. And yes, people in positions of authority hold an extra responsibility as part of being leaders in cultivating those kinds of spaces. And so, as you'll see here in the words of Meta Bull, the more intentionality and greater awareness we have of how we want to show up, the more we can impact what the state of the social field is, how generative it becomes. And so I'd like to invite you in the chat just to share, what are the kinds of qualities of a generative social field in your view? And here you might think of a classroom, a workplace, a team. It might have been a sports team, a family, a friend group that felt to you generative, that it felt trusting, supportive. What did it feel like? What did it look like? What did it sound like? So just taking a moment and just sharing any reflections in the chat that you may have about what does that kind of generative space look like to you? Feel like you do? So here I say love, care, listening, freedom, respect. I can show up as me. An atmosphere that encourages learning and reflection. I love this one. Simultaneously challenging and safe, right? It's not a space of complacency, one that pushes us and inspires us. But yeah, maybe there's a lightness or humor, not taking ourselves too seriously, but committed. Mistakes are okay. Authentic, hard conversations held with empathy and softness, right? That ability to hold compassion for one another. Giving opinions that don't cancel out others, becoming active listeners. Compassionate towards others, and particularly the most vulnerable, right? How do we hold and really cultivate that space where we feel that kind of safety and belonging that we can work towards, what we care most about. I'm loving this sharing in the chat. So showing up as we are, encouragement, lack of destructive criticism, but constructive, right? So yeah, again, it's not about just, pretending is everything okay. The hard conversations can be there. The constructive feedback can be there. But it's about wrestling with. So if we think back to that, systems thinking iceberg and the mental models, how, and for many folks who have been on a journey of, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work and equity work, it means really hard conversations, real reflective moments where sometimes we need colleagues to hold a kind of mirror window up to us, to understand ourselves in different ways, particularly where we're contributing to toxic systems and be unwitting or unknowing of that, right? And so we need these trusted spaces. And I love this. It's okay to not be okay. So how do we show up as our authentic, whole selves, including when it's hard, when we're at our most vulnerable, right? But then we feel safe to do so, right? Is there a comment? So we're going to move to our final tool of today. Coming out of this kind of, space of how do we kind of generate these kinds of spaces for ourselves and with others. And in part in that generative term, which generative, it's creating something, it's generating, it's bringing something into being, right? And so we're going to do a little practice with vision, which was that final stool. So if you remember that systems thinking, or the three-legged stool of leadership, right? Understanding systems, understanding complexity. So we did some practice in that. Reflective conversations, so our ability to reflect as we are right now within our breakout groups, really attending to how we're showing up within those spaces together towards this generative social space. And then the final around aspiration, our ability to cultivate individual and our shared vision. And so we're going to work on the final tool, which is called the creative tension principle. And so this is illustrated here in this diagram, but my teacher, Peter Senge, adapted this exercise from the musician and composer and systems thinker, Robert Fritz. He calls this principle structural tension. We call it creative tension, towards that kind of sense of creativity, creating something into vision. But they illustrate it, I'm going to make sure I'm in the screen right, with a rubber band. So you'll see here this rubber band, right? And so at one end, we have a vision, right? As we think about what we envision for our lives, for that of our communities, for the communities that we might serve. So we have this vision up here. And then on the other hand, we have current reality. And so we can imagine it as maybe, one on top of the other. And you can see where, if I have my vision and my current reality, if they're very close together, rubber bands, it's nice and loose, right? It feels right within reach. But if that vision and that current reality are really far away, we see a lot of, a little sound here with my rubber band, structural tension, right? That it feels like, ooh, it's sort of tight. And we might feel, if you imagine that kind of difference between vision and current reality, and you might be imagining some for yourself right now, and I'm going to have you invite us all to do that in a moment. You might feel some emotional tension, right? Oh, why are things not the way I wish they were? Why are things, maybe I'm stuck in that current reality, and that vision just feels like it's never going to be possible. And so that emotional tension might just feel too much for us. So perhaps we lower our vision. Or another way would be to improve current reality, to work at the space, still holding that vision, but working towards how do we shift our current reality using some of these strategies that we've talked about today, creating generative spaces so that teams are working better together in a more trusting way, in a more generative way, understanding the kind of structural dynamics that enable us to work, at those more high impact leverage points rather than kind of sticking on, those habitual quick fixes. And so there we begin to get closer and closer to that current reality. So maybe perhaps we have then a new vision, right? And there's the ongoing human dynamic, and so many who might have achieved a goal will know that feeling of, I set a goal, I achieved it, but maybe I don't feel quite satisfied because actually your vision has changed, and as it should, right? That's part of the unique human dynamic, that we're always setting these aspirations, but we have to really be able to account for and hold that current reality, being okay with what is, not in a kind of complacency, but it's something to drive us to move towards that vision. And so in our final practice today, I'm going to have us do a little grounding around this vision and this current reality. And this is part of that space of how do we cultivate, awareness of ourselves and how we show up, as well as how do we cultivate that sense of shared vision. So I'll have you just kind of get in a nice, comfortable position, just kind of quiet your mind from all that we've maybe discussed or said here. I invite you to close your eyes or find just kind of a neutral spot on the ground or on the table to rest your gaze. There's no need to look at the screen. If you feel more comfortable turning off your camera, that's fine to do so too. And you might just adjust your posture so that, you're sitting in a nice relaxed position, your spine upright, not too rigid. Like move your neck a little bit, just releasing any tension. And I invite you to take a few slow, deep breaths. As we breathe, and exhale, just releasing any tension you might feel. Just relaxing into this present moment. Just noticing the sensations of breath. As it comes in your nostrils or your mouth. Filling your lungs, you might notice the rise, your belly, releasing. Just taking a few slow breaths, just at your own pace. Your mind might wander, and just gently return it back to the breath, without judgment. Letting the distractions just come and go. Just anchoring back in the breath, in your body. Now I'd like you to imagine a vision. Your vision. It might be part of what motivated you to be here today. The vision you have for your community, the community you may serve, even for yourself. So just whatever comes to mind when I say that word vision. Just to spend some time just exploring that. Your mind's eye. What does it look like? If your vision was made possible, if it were achieved, what would that look like? Feel like? Just noticing the emotions, sensations that come up as you imagine that vision. If anything were possible, what would that look like, this vision? I invite you to draw in all the senses. What does it sound like? Smell like? Taste like? Who's there? Is there anybody with you in that space? What are you doing? What's the feeling there? Now, with another deep breath, let me just release. Release the vision, release the activity, just coming back to your breath. Let's take another deep breath. Now I'd like you to bring to your eye the current reality of that situation. And here I just invite you to notice, what does it feel like? Sound like? What emotions, thoughts are present? Here, we're not trying to fix or solve anything, just letting it be, just sitting with the current reality. Just holding space for what is. I invite you to take another deep breath. And I'd like you to bring your vision back up, and you might imagine it like two screens side by side. Your vision, one side, current reality on the other, and we're just holding them both. You might imagine it even as the rubber band. We're just holding both that vision and the current reality. Just noticing what it feels like to hold them both. Just remembering to breathe. Now I'd like you to think about that space in between as a creative space, as one that can propel you forward, as a one that can bring you and your community towards that aspiration, towards that vision, as a generative kind of energy. Just noticing the emotions, sensations that may come up as you imagine that creative space in between. With another deep breath, as you let go, release, you might begin to just move the body, just kind of stretch, slowly open your eyes and return to our space together. So I invite you, if you have that paper still near you, just to sketch down a few words. I also invite you just to share any reflections that you have in the chat, or to feel free to unmute yourself. Just what's that experience like? What does it feel like to work with our vision in this way? And then I might invite you, what's your vision for this system? So what kinds of keywords or images appeared for you? So take a moment just to pause and reflect, and then we can do some sharing. Final moments together, just inviting if anyone feels inspired to share their vision. So it could be this vision for this migration summit community, this system, vision you have personally for your community, any kind of keywords, images that come to you when you do this exercise and you imagine that creative vision.
Just quickly, I felt the rubber band was too tight. And yeah, when I was thinking about what you and how you put it, like I felt that was a very tight rubber band, and I'm not sure. Yeah, it just raised questions. I don't have answers. I feel like I discovered more questions.
And maybe the first step is just noticing that tightness, that emotional tension. I'm reminded the rubber band is not distraught about this, just a structural tension for it. It doesn't feel an emotional tension. So us humans have the fortune of feeling those emotions. So how do we attend to those emotions in our care so that space doesn't feel so tight, but one that feels generative towards, right? And so that's part of the work of how do we take care of ourselves when that rubber band does feel too tight, and attend to what we need so that we can continue to carry that work. Now, I see in the chat, it's emotional work, right? We're always already emotional beings within these systems, yet aren't always invited to kind of attend to that. And so I hope, if anything, this session today gave you some space, bring some awareness to your emotions in these processes, and how do we work individually and collectively towards cultivating the kinds of generative spaces for us to work together to advance compassionate systems change. And that's where that keyword compassion comes back in. So it's really attending to the emotional qualities what it means to change education systems. So thank you all for joining us today. I invite you to join us throughout this month of learning for Migration Summit 2023. A recording of today's session will be captioned and published on the Migration Summit YouTube channel. Well, no, not the breakout rooms discussions, that's for you. And we invite you to register and join us for future sessions throughout the month. Especially invite you to join us for our Friday reflections. We'll be working with some of these, what does it mean to work throughout this month-long summit with those kinds of emotional registers. So especially like to highlight those. So thank you all, be well, and take care. Thanks for joining us today. Feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye in whatever language or way you choose. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Gracias.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was great.